I sat there frozen, the foreclosure notice still trembling in my hands as the morning light bled through the blinds. The bold red stamp glared up at me, a verdict disguised as ink. "She's powerless now," my son's friend had said, their laughter carrying across the church lawn like a funeral hymn. Powerless. After 20 years on the night shift, after paying every mortgage check on time, after 68 years of building a life that was supposed to mean something, I was powerless. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The paper bag bit into Helen Ward's forearm as she stepped off the curb, its bottom sagging under the weight of discount groceries. Cream of mushroom, dry cereal, generic ibuprofen. Enough to get through another week without seeing anyone. She kept her eyes down, heading for the cracked Civic parked beneath a yellowing oak. Then she heard it. Low voices knotted together with a thin string of laughter. "She's hanging on by a thread," someone muttered. Another voice, unmistakably Rachel Donnelly's, sharpened the air. "She's broke. Sick. Powerless now." Helen froze behind the hedge bordering the church lawn. Her breath caught before she could stop it. She didn't need to peek. She knew Rachel's voice too well. The sticky, sweet tone. The performative concern that always ended with something sharp and true enough to bleed. A third woman, probably Jeanette Wallace, Helen guessed by the cadence, let out a snort. "She used to correct everyone, now she doesn't even show her face," Rachel tisked. Tragic, really. Laughter followed. Not loud, not cruel, just casual. Like Helen's undoing was a story passed around at brunch. She backed away before they could see her, cutting across the alley behind the market. Her shoes scuffed wet leaves as she moved, faster now, breathing like she'd just been slapped. The bag tore slightly at the corner and a can of soup slipped out, clattering across the pavement. She didn't go back for it. Mark was by the fireplace when she walked in, untouched drink in hand, scrolling through news on his phone like nothing outside their walls had teeth. Helen dropped the bag on the kitchen counter, paper splitting wide. "Rachel's talking about me, again." He didn't look up. "What else is new?" "She's saying I'm sick, that I've lost everything." Mark exhaled through his nose. Still scrolling. "Helen, it's Elridge. People talk. They're bored." She moved closer, her voice tightening. "They're laughing at me." That made him glance her way, but only briefly. "Because you disappeared. You didn't go to Kate's birthday or the PTA auction. You haven't even stepped foot in church since—" "I was fired, Mark. And people notice," he said flatly, sipping the scotch. "Does it matter what Rachel says?" Helen stared at him, something sinking deeper in her chest. "It should matter to you." Mark didn't answer. He tapped his phone screen and walked out of the room. The silence after he left felt heavier than any insult. Helen sat at the edge of the couch, coat still on, bag half unpacked. The hum of the fridge filled the space where conversation should have been. Her pulse throbbed behind her eyes. Her phone buzzed. Clara. Her screen lit up. She hesitated, then answered. "You okay?" Clara asked instantly, no small talk. Helen didn't respond right away. "I saw what Rachel posted," Clara added. Back when she had everything garbage. Disgusting." Helen closed her eyes. "She said I'm powerless." "You're not," Clara said firmly. "She made it sound like I deserved it." "She's projecting. She's always hated women who don't beg to be liked." Helen turned toward the window, watching the porch light flicker through the haze of early autumn. Her reflection stared back at her. Pale skin, too much shadow around the eyes, hair pulled into a loose bun that hadn't been brushed in 2 days. But the look in her face wasn't broken. It was restrained. "I think they're waiting for me to disappear," she said. They'll be waiting a long damn time, Clara said. Helen didn't answer. She let the silence hang between them. Not awkward, just honest. Clara's voice softened. Do you want me to come over? No, Helen said. Not tonight. After the call, Helen moved through the house like it didn't quite belong to her anymore. The walls looked smaller. Every photo felt like it had dust on it, even the new ones. She stood in front of the mirror in the hallway and forced herself to hold her own gaze. You're not done, she thought. She reached into the drawer by the entryway, pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. She hadn't touched it in almost 10 years, not since she left the courtroom behind and let other people do the fighting. She flipped it open, eyes narrowing as she skimmed old names, notes, timelines, buried things, people she once helped, people she once held power over, and the people who'd taken that power from her. Her fingers stopped on a name she hadn't thought about in years, Rachel Donnelly. Helen didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. The morning light was dull and overcast, filtering through the blinds like it was too tired to fully commit. Helen sat at the dining table in the same robe she'd slept in, hair pulled back, glasses perched low on her nose. A stack of unopened envelopes sat beside a half-drunk cup of coffee, its surface forming a thin, bitter skin. The one she opened first wasn't even in her name. Notice of public foreclosure proceedings, property auction pending. She blinked once, then again. Her thumb traced the bottom line of the page like touching it might change the meaning. The letter was addressed to Mark A. Ward, not Mr. and Mrs., not the Wards, just him. Her hands steadied as she flipped through the attached documents. Legal jargon spilled across each page. Liens, unpaid balances, transfer dates. But Helen knew how to read filings. She'd been sharp once, sharp enough to see the trick buried 3 pages deep. One of the property transfers had Mark's name only, no joint ownership, no disclosure. It wasn't just a foreclosure. It was a setup. He'd shifted the deed into a trust 5 months ago. A quiet legal sleight of hand, recorded in a county office most people never thought to check. She felt her breath lock in her chest as her eyes scanned the signature line. He hadn't forged hers. He hadn't needed to. Because her name was never on the refinance to begin with. The sound of the front door opening broke the silence. Mark's voice followed, casual as ever. Coffee still hot? Helen didn't answer. She gathered the papers into a neat pile and set them beside her. Mark walked in, loosening his tie like it was just another Wednesday. His eyes flicked to the table. You opened my mail? I opened our future, she said. He paused mid-step. She tapped the stack with her nail. You didn't tell me you moved the deed. Mark exhaled through his nose like she was dragging him into another unnecessary mess. I did what made sense at the time. No, she said flatly. You did what protected you. He looked away. You weren't in a place to make decisions. Helen leaned back in the chair. And you made sure I wouldn't be. He picked up the letter, skimmed the top line, then dropped it back on the table. It's just a notice. We're not out yet. We're not in either. His jaw flexed once. It won't go to auction. She watched him lie, the way his tone curved upward, just a touch. Familiar now. Like a man trying to convince himself of his own decency. When he left the room, she didn't follow. 2 hours later, Clara pulled into the driveway with a bag of gas station snacks and a face that didn't ask questions, just offered answers in advance. Helen sat on the porch steps, fingers pressed against her temple. He moved the house behind my back, she said. Clara handed her a cold Diet Coke. You think he wants you homeless? I think he wants to walk away clean, Helen murmured. And I think he's been planning it for longer than I've admitted. Clara nodded slowly. And the auction? Helen opened the can, let it hiss. Less than 30 days. They sat in silence, Cars humming by in the distance, leaves brushing across the pavement like time trying to whisper past. Auctions don't always end how people think, Clara said at last. People show up, people bid. It gets interesting. Helen gave a soft huff. I don't have the kind of money to get interesting. You have something better. Clara nudged her elbow. You have motive. That night, Helen sat cross-legged on the floor of her closet, her laptop open beside her, a spreadsheet glowing faintly in the dim light. The numbers weren't comforting. A few savings bonds from her late aunt, the remainder of her severance. A dusty IRA she hadn't touched since her first paralegal job. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. And if she moved carefully, quietly, Mark wouldn't see her coming. She clicked open a new tab and typed in the county's auction site. Lot numbers, time slots, listings still being finalized, but her address was already there. Scheduled, October 11th, 10 Maz a.m. Helen closed the laptop and sat still, listening to the creak of the house settle around her. Her house. Not his. Not yet. The courthouse didn't look like much. Just a squat, gray government building tucked between a shuttered bakery and a dry cleaner that hadn't bothered to replace its flickering sign since 2009. But inside, everything was rigid. Sterile. Metal benches lined the hallway like waiting rooms for judgment. Helen walked past them with measured steps, her blazer too tight across the shoulders, her flats pinching where they used to fit. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. At the registration desk, a laminated sign read, Real Property Auction, Pre-Registration Required. A woman in a lilac sweater looked up and smiled absently. Here for probate or property? Property, Helen said quietly. Name? Ward, she replied. Helen Ward. The woman's fingers clacked across the keyboard. You'll need to fill out Form C-13 and we'll need an ID and proof of funds for initial bid eligibility. Helen nodded. I have both. She slid a slim folder from her tote. She'd triple-checked everything, scanned it, printed backups, even had Clara look it over twice. Every dollar she could legally access was accounted for, right down to the cents. The woman handed her a clipboard. You're cutting it close. Deadline's noon tomorrow. You planning to bid personally or through proxy? Personally. That got a look. But the clerk didn't comment. Just handed her a pale green bidder card. You're number 68. Helen didn't look at it long. She slipped it behind her checkbook and tucked the whole folder deep into her purse. She was almost to the exit when she heard a voice from behind. Helen Ward? She turned. Elaine Meadows, now a deputy clerk, came down the hall in black slacks and sensible shoes. Her blonde curls were shorter than they'd been at the firm, and her face wore less makeup, but the steel behind her eyes hadn't softened. Helen blinked, caught off guard. Elaine. Elaine offered a small, wary smile. I saw your name on the pre-reg list. Took me a minute to believe it. Helen gave a tired nod. Believe it. Elaine stepped closer. You're bidding on your own property? Helen didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elaine's mouth tightened. Then you'll want to make sure the title clause doesn't conflict with the trust. If Mark filed it wrong, there might be a way to argue standing. I know, Helen said, but if it goes clean, I'd rather be ready. Elaine nodded. I can help check the wording. Just unofficially. Helen met her eyes. Why? Elaine shrugged. Because Rachel ruined my sister's mortgage approval 3 years ago with a fake reference, and because I don't owe Mark a damn thing. Helen's expression didn't change, but for the first time that morning her jaw unclenched. Later, outside in the lot, Clara leaned against her Subaru with a wrinkled grocery bag in her hands. Something for the cause, she said, handing it over. Helen opened the bag and froze. Inside was a plain white envelope with a rubber band around it. Clara. Don't start, Clara said. It's not mine. Church Fellowship Fund, the discretionary one we don't announce. After the DiMartino fire, it never got used again. I checked the bylaws. It's legit. Helen stared at her. Clara sighed. People don't need to know how much pain you're in to want you to keep your damn house. Helen's fingers closed around the envelope slowly. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Keep it off the books, Clara added. Bid low. Stay under radar. Helen gave a faint nod. I registered this morning. Good. Clara looked out toward the road. He doesn't know, does he? No. Keep it that way. That night, Helen sat at her kitchen table refreshing her screen. She didn't follow Rachel on social media anymore, but Elridge wasn't that big. Someone always sent her the screenshots. There Rachel was, standing in front of Helen's soon-to-be auctioned house, wearing sunglasses, holding a designer coffee, smiling like she'd already closed escrow. Can't wait to modernize this old beauty, change future renovations, new beginnings. The comments poured in. That porch has so much potential. You'll make it stunning. OMG, you're buying it? Rachel had replied with a winking emoji. Helen stared at the post until her eyes burned. Then she clicked the screen off, got up, and opened the hall closet. At the bottom, behind a box of old Christmas lights, was her black leather briefcase. She hadn't used it since she walked out of the firm, but the combination still clicked open. Inside was the old courtroom binder, tabs still crisp. Sections labeled like muscle memory, ownership challenges, injunction templates, probate loopholes. She didn't smile. She simply began to review. The sound of silverware scraping porcelain had never felt so violent. Mark chewed with his mouth half open, fork clinking against his molars as he shoveled in another bite of pot roast. Across from him, Rachel dabbed at her lips with a paper napkin like she was playing at being genteel, her wine glass dangerously close to Helen's old wedding china. I forgot how good this dining room feels in the fall, Rachel said, eyes flicking up toward the high windows. So much potential once the lighting's updated. Maybe a statement chandelier? Helen didn't look up from her plate. She cut a green bean into thirds, then into halves again. The knife made a soft rhythmic tapping on the plate. The roast was overcooked, dried out at the edges. Mark had insisted she make something normal since Abby was coming home from college for the weekend. Rachel had invited herself. She's getting better at this, Rachel added, nudging Mark with her elbow. I mean, considering the circumstances. Mark gave a low grunt that could have meant anything. Rachel was already mid-laugh. Sorry, she said, placing a hand over her chest. I meant, considering the medical bills. It's so easy for things to spiral. Across the table, Abby froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Her eyes darted toward her mother, then down again. Helen raised her gaze, slowly. Rachel met it, smiled. I mean, Mark told me a little, she continued, swirling wine in her glass. I can't imagine how hard it must have been. The job loss, the, health scare. But you're doing your best. That's what matters. Helen took a sip of water, her face still. I didn't realize you two were in such frequent contact. Oh, just checking in, Rachel said brightly. We have history, right? Can't just let that fall away? Abby set her fork down. Mark cleared his throat. Rachel's been helping me understand the trust process better. She's handled a few refinances herself, so... Helen nodded once. Of course. Her voice was perfectly calm. Abby stood abruptly. I'm gonna get some air. Rachel blinked. Something I said? Abby didn't answer. She slipped out to the porch, the door clicking gently behind her. Mark reached for more roast, oblivious. Helen rose from her seat slowly, her movements precise. She carried her plate to the sink, ran cold water over the scraps, and stared out the window for a moment before turning back. Dessert? She asked. Rachel grinned. If you've got it. Helen pulled a pie from the fridge, store-bought, still in its plastic clamshell, and placed it on the counter without ceremony. She set down plates, one at a time. Rachel didn't move to help. The text buzzed in her pocket just as she sliced the pie. Clara. All paperwork confirmed. Elaine triple-checked. You're clear to bid and block. Helen slid her phone back into her pocket, expression unchanged. Pumpkin, she said. Rachel nodded. Very seasonal. Mark kept eating. The dull thud of utensils and the tick of the wall clock filled the room. A draft slipped under the back door. Cool, sharp. A breath of October warning what was coming. Later, when the guests had gone and the dishwasher hummed quietly behind her, Helen stood at the sink with her hands braced on the counter. The pie sat mostly untouched. Rachel's wineglass still bore a lipstick print like a small red wound. Helen picked it up, poured it out, rinsed the glass until it ran clean. Then she walked to the hall closet, opened the black briefcase again, and pulled out a single manila folder. Inside was the counter motion she'd written in secret 2 nights earlier. The clause Elaine had flagged was there, underlined. If the trust filing date conflicted with the auction registration, she could stall it, freeze it, force a hearing. Rachel and Mark could take their smug dinner, their future renovations, their open-mouthed chewing, and choke on it. Helen closed the folder. The wind picked up outside, rattling the porch swing against the rail. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed without looking back. The room smelled faintly of varnished wood and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed above a sea of folding chairs lined up in uneven rows. A plastic table at the front held a single microphone, a water bottle, and a gavel Helen suspected was mostly for show. County auction days weren't glamorous, but today, they were crowded. She sat in the back row, her coat folded neatly in her lap, bidder card hidden beneath it. Her pulse was calm, slower than she expected. Clara sat beside her, spine straight, hair tucked neatly behind her ears. A hymn hummed quietly from her throat, something ancient and wordless. Up front, Auctioneer Thomas adjusted his tie, wiped his brow, and tapped the mic. Next item on the docket, Lot 3324, residential parcel, 27 Elmwood Drive. A murmur rippled through the room. That address wasn't just known, it was recognized. Rachel Donnelly, perched smugly in the second row, tilted her head and whispered something to the couple beside her. They leaned in. One chuckled. Another looked back over his shoulder. Helen didn't flinch. She shifted her weight slightly, enough to signal that she was present but uninterested in theatrics. Let them think she was just a neighbor come to spectate. That suited her fine. Clara leaned in just enough to whisper, "You're the quietest power in this room." Helen didn't smile, but she met her friend's eyes, steady, unmoved. Auctioneer Thomas cleared his throat. This property has an opening bid of $18,500, as always. Clear title and taxes included, pending final confirmation. Do I hear an opening bid? Rachel raised her card immediately. 19. It was an aggressive move. She hadn't waited, hadn't played polite. Helen could practically hear her old courtroom mentor's voice in her head. If they start loud, they're hoping to end fast. Do I have 20? A hand in the far corner lifted. 21? Thomas prompted. Rachel's hand shot up again. 21.5. A few neighbors began murmuring. Whispers passed like wind through the pews. She's really going for it. Isn't that her ex's place? No, it's Helen's. Or was... Clara squeezed Helen's hand beneath the coat. The envelope with the emergency church fund pressed gently against her thigh, a quiet promise in paper form. Helen didn't move. Rachel raised the bid again. 23 even. No pause, no hesitation. But there was something else in her posture now. Impatience. She was bidding as if she already owned it, and every offer felt like a personal offense. Helen watched her closely. measured every blink, every glance toward the back of the room. Rachel hadn't noticed her. Not yet. "Do I have 24? Thomas called. Someone in the middle row hesitated, lifted a hand. 24. Rachel turned halfway in her seat, eyes narrowing. 25, she barked. The man lowered his card. Thomas smiled tightly. 25 to bidder 12. Going once. Helen reached into her coat and slid the pale green card halfway up. She didn't lift it high. Just enough. 26. The voice didn't waver. It came from her own throat, clear and low. Rachel's head jerked around so fast it was almost comical. She scanned the rows and saw Helen. Her face didn't crumple. It didn't twist in rage. It froze, like she'd seen a ghost. "Bidder 68, Thomas said, glancing down at his sheet. 26. "Do I hear 27? Rachel blinked. Her grip on her card faltered. Then, trying to recover, she lifted it again. 27. Helen said nothing. Thomas scanned the room. 28? A long pause. No one moved. Clara whispered, "Do you want to keep going?" Helen kept her gaze forward, her pulse still steady. The manila folder in her briefcase, back home, on her desk, contained a filed motion stamped with that morning's date. If she wanted, she could invoke it right now. Stall the auction, trigger a hearing. But first, she wanted Rachel to sweat. She raised her card again. 28, she said. Thomas nodded. "Bidder 68, 28,000 even." Rachel stared at her, lips parted, face pale. Thomas lifted the gavel slowly. Going once. The room inhaled all at once, not loudly but collectively, like the oxygen had shifted. From the second Helen spoke, hands curled around her pale green bidder card, murmurs began to rise in low, uneven waves. It started with a woman in the third row, nudging her husband, then another near the back, whispering behind a man's shoulder. "Is that Helen Ward? She's bidding? I thought she moved out. No, she never left." He did. "That's her house." Rachel straightened like a mannequin snapping upright in a display window. The smug veneer drained from her face, leaving behind something colder, tighter. Her lips pressed together, the kind of smile people give when they don't know whether to laugh or scream. Auctioneer Thomas adjusted his stance. 28 to bidder 68. "Do I hear 29? Rachel's fingers twitched. Her bidder card was still raised, but she didn't speak. Then came the voice, sharp and low, from 2 rows ahead of Helen. "Mom," Mark hissed, "stop embarrassing us." Heads turned. Even Rachel flinched. He sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight, sleeves rolled up to the elbows like he was ready to do damage control. His eyes locked on Helen, but there was no warmth, just irritation masked as concern. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered. Clara shifted slightly beside her. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was solid, like an anchor holding Helen's posture upright. Helen didn't look at her son. She lifted the card again. 29, she said, her voice flat, deliberate. Thomas barely blinked. "Bidder 68, 29,000. Someone near the wall whispered, "Damn." Another added, "Well, she lived there." Rachel's head turned, slow and deliberate. "She's bluffing," she said loudly, directing it more to the crowd than the auctioneer. "She doesn't have the capital. This is petty." No one laughed. That was the difference. 3 weeks ago, they might have chuckled along, nodded in silent agreement that Helen was dramatic, unwell, whatever Rachel had planted. But now, the silence that followed felt curious. People were watching her differently, not as a woman unraveling, but as something far more unpredictable. A woman with a plan. Thomas cleared his throat again. "Do I hear 30? Rachel raised her card. 30 even. Her voice cracked slightly. just enough to draw Clara's eyebrow upward. Helen waited. Let the silence press in. She could feel her son watching her. Mark's foot tapped uncontrollably, a habit he picked up in high school when called to the board with a math problem he hadn't studied for. Thomas looked around. 30 to bidder 12. Going once. Helen didn't blink. She raised her card. 31. Clara murmured under her breath. God, I love you. Thomas nodded. Bidder 68. 31,000. Do I hear 32? Rachel didn't respond. Thomas hesitated. Helen leaned back slightly in her seat. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She held the room. Rachel looked at Mark. He shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. A calculation passed between them, a flash of strategy and ego and cost. But something else sat inside that moment. Something Rachel hadn't prepared for. Helen wasn't just bidding, she was winning. Thomas raised the gavel again. 31 to bidder 68, going once. Rachel gripped her card, but her hand hovered, unsure, her jaw clenched. Going twice. The gavel dropped with a hard wooden crack. Sold, Thomas announced, voice cutting through the silence. To bidder 68 for 31,000 even. Chairs squeaked, necks turned. A few soft gasps broke out in the back. Helen stood slowly, tucking her bidder card back into her coat. The whispers swelling around her didn't faze her. She stepped forward with calm precision, heels clicking steadily on tile. Clara rose beside her, matching her pace like muscle to Helen's skeleton, quiet, unshakable. They walked the aisle together, past neighbors who had avoided eye contact for weeks, past the woman who had once whispered to Helen in church about casseroles and courage, now whispering about her bid. Rachel sat frozen in her chair, as if trying to process the moment before it hardened into something irreversible. Thomas stood waiting at the folding table, final paperwork already spread before him. Payment due now, he said, lifting a form with faint blue carbon paper beneath it. Certified only. Helen opened her purse without a word. From inside, she withdrew a flat envelope, creased once, labeled neatly. She slid the certified check across the table. Thomas unfolded it, held it to the light, checked the seal, ran his fingers along the edges. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then, confirmed. He stamped the payment page with a heavy red paid, the sound loud and final. Behind them, Mark's voice cracked the stillness. What the hell? Helen didn't look at him. He moved up the aisle, slow and stunned, face losing its color with each step. Where did you get that money? His voice wasn't angry. Not yet. It was the voice of someone realizing a game he thought he was winning had changed rules entirely. Helen continued filling out the final form. Her pen didn't pause. Mark turned to Clara. Was it you? Did you fund this? Clara folded her arms. Nope. But I know a few decent people who believe in second chances. Rachel scoffed. This is fraud, she said louder, trying to find her footing. She forged that check, or borrowed it. There's no way she qualifies. There's no way this is legal. Thomas looked up from the documents. Voice neutral but firm. All credentials verified through county clerk. The bidder is valid. The sale is final. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed again. Her hand trembled slightly on the strap of her designer handbag. Helen finished signing the form, pressing her thumb to the bottom where the stamp awaited. When she lifted her hand, the ink left a clean, certain print. She passed the pen back to Thomas and gathered her paperwork. As she turned, Mark reached out slightly, an automatic gesture, not affection, just grasping for something he no longer had control over. Helen, he said, like her name might still work. She didn't respond. Rachel stepped into the aisle, trying to block her path. You think this is over? Helen stopped, looked her in the eye. No, she said simply. But your leverage is. Then she walked past her, straight-backed and unbothered. Near the wall, Abby stood half-hidden in a cluster of older neighbors. She wore her college hoodie, sleeves tugged over her hands. Her expression was unreadable at first. But then she stepped out of the group. She didn't speak. She just gave a small smile, one Helen hadn't seen in years. One that said, maybe. Maybe I see you. Maybe I get it now. Maybe I remember who you were before all this. Helen's lips didn't move. But her eyes held the moment. It was enough. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, lighting the courthouse sidewalk in amber. Leaves swirled across the concrete like the beginning of something. Clara touched Helen's arm lightly. We should go. They reached the car without looking back. But just before the door closed, Clara glanced over her shoulder. Rachel stood by the entrance, digging frantically through her phone, already calling someone. Her voice was hushed, but her gestures were sharp. Pointed, angry, desperate. Helen didn't ask who it was. She already knew the next move wouldn't come through the front door. It would come through court. Elaine's stamp landed with a final thunk, the blue ink still gleaming across the top of the page. Recorded, she said, sliding the final sheet forward across the desk. Effective immediately, the title is in your name. Sole ownership. Uncontested. Helen nodded once, lips barely parted, but her hand didn't hesitate as she reached for the deed. Her name sat at the top in bold serif type. Helen Maris Ward. Clean. No cosigners, no trust loophole. No mark. Behind her, the courthouse annex buzzed faintly with hallway foot traffic. Fluorescent lights flickered above. The title clerk at the counter 2 windows down was explaining boundary lines to a couple in flannel jackets, but Helen didn't hear any of it. For the first time in months, maybe years, the noise around her faded beneath the sound of her own breath. Steady. Earned. Elaine leaned forward. You understand this locks it. He can't challenge it now without court-ordered grounds. I understand, Helen said. She picked up the folder, slid the signed deed inside, and closed it gently. That's when the yelling started. Rachel's voice cut through the hallway like metal dragged across stone. This is a goddamn joke, she snapped, heels clacking furiously toward the records window. She bought her own house back and now she gets to walk away with a ribbon on top? Elaine didn't look up. Please step back, ma'am. You think this is fair? Rachel barked. You all knew what she was doing. You let her bend the rules because she cried and played victim long enough. Mark stepped up behind her, flanking the counter like he still had authority here. He turned toward Thomas, who had just exited the adjoining conference room. We're not finished, Mark said sharply. There's room to contest this. The trust was active. Thomas didn't even blink. Then file a civil suit. But the sale was legal, certified, and closed. You lost. You think I won't go public with what I know? Mark pushed, stepping closer. Elaine turned her head slightly. Sir, I'd strongly recommend you not raise your voice in a government building. Mark glanced around. No one looked scared. No one moved to support him. He stepped back, jaw tight, the heat behind his eyes shifting into something else. Panic dressed as arrogance. Rachel scoffed, loud and bitter. Enjoy it while it lasts. Clara walked up beside Helen, camera already out. Smile, she whispered. This one's not for them. It's for you. Helen didn't grin, she didn't pose. But she held the deed in both hands, centered against her chest like a slow-blooming truth, and nodded once. Clara snapped the photo. Click. Rachel muttered something and stormed off, Mark following close behind. Neither of them looked back. Abby waited just outside, leaning against one of the stone columns lining the courthouse steps. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, earbuds half dangling from her hoodie. When she saw Helen emerge, she stepped forward, hesitant. I wasn't sure you'd still be here. Helen nodded. Paperwork took a minute. Abby glanced toward the parking lot where Rachel and Mark's car had just peeled out. Then she looked back at her grandmother. Really looked. Without another word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her. Not tight. Not dramatic. Just long enough to matter. Helen let herself return the hug. Abby pulled back slightly. Mom's gonna lose her mind when she sees the photo. I'm counting on it, Clara muttered behind them. Helen finally smiled, just slightly. They walked down the steps together, but as they reached the bottom, Elaine emerged from the building again, holding her phone. Helen, she called, voice sharper now. I just got word. Rachel filed a motion to freeze transfer of utilities. Emergency injunction? Helen stopped. Clara frowned. Can she do that? Elaine nodded. Temporary disruption only. She's stalling. Trying to clog up everything she can. Helen didn't sigh. She didn't panic. She just tightened her grip on the folder. Let her. The small back office of the clerk's annex smelled like printer toner and stale coffee, but it felt like a sanctuary. Helen sat across from Elaine, who adjusted her glasses and spread a series of documents across the laminate desk. These are county certified, Elaine said, tapping each page in turn. Deed of transfer, payment verification, auction summary. And this, she held up a single gold-stamped certificate. Makes it airtight. No liens, no active encumbrances. It's yours, permanently. Helen exhaled, long and low. The kind of breath you didn't know you were holding until it left you. Even with the motion Rachel filed? Elaine nodded. Utilities are an inconvenience, but title isn't in question. We had it triple logged the morning of the sale. She can stall, but she can't reverse. Helen didn't smile, not exactly, but something eased in her jaw. Behind her, through the cracked door, voices carried from the lobby. Louder now. Angrier. I know she pulled something, Rachel hissed. Her voice bounced hard off the courthouse marble. She had nothing 2 months ago. No job, no husband, no standing. And now she owns the house? A few neighbors lingered around the bulletin board, listening but pretending not to. One of them, Donna from the garden club, raised an eyebrow. Another woman smirked and turned away. She's a fraud, Rachel continued. She always was. No one cares, Rach, someone muttered. You lost. Rachel spun. Excuse me? Elaine stepped out from the annex doorway, calm and deliberate. You're welcome to review the documents. They're public record. Rachel flared. Oh, I intend to. Because when it turns out she manipulated this process. She didn't, Elaine said. You were just unprepared. Mark pushed through the crowd, red-faced and silent until now. This whole thing stinks, and I'm not going to stand here while she... You're free to leave, Elaine said. He stared at her. I said, Elaine added, voice like dry ice. You're free to leave. Mark looked around, but the room had already shifted. The audience wasn't his anymore, not even close. He cursed under his breath and stormed out the main door, pushing past a man holding a toddler. Rachel lingered longer, but when no one followed, no one backed her. She walked out too, chin high, shoes too loud, heart too visible. Later that afternoon, Helen sat in her usual booth at Ethel's diner, tucked beside the window facing Main Street. The house keys, still warm from her palm, lay on the table beside her coffee mug. Clara slid in across from her with 2 lemonades and a grin that nearly split her face. Well, she said, raising her glass. To bureaucratic brilliance and certified vengeance. Helen raised her coffee. To not screaming in public. Clara laughed. You came close. I really didn't. That's what makes it scarier. Their glasses clinked. The sound was light, clean, honest. Clara pulled out her phone and showed Helen the photo again, her standing outside the courthouse with the deed clutched to her chest, the sun casting a golden line behind her like the start of something new. She's going to lose her mind when she sees this posted. Let her. Clara sipped her lemonade. You know they'll try something else. Helen nodded. I'm counting on it. She looked out the window watching cars pass. People crossed streets without looking both ways. A child laughed at the top of their lungs from somewhere near the post office. For the first time in months. Maybe longer. Helen didn't feel the press of everyone else's expectations on her spine. She just was. Present. Breathing. Alive. Behind the counter, Ethel waved her over. Honey, you've got mail. Helen frowned, sliding out of the booth. Ethel held up a slim manila envelope. No stamp, no return address. Someone dropped it by about 20 minutes ago, Ethel said. Didn't catch who. Helen took it, turning it over slowly in her hands. The seal had been slit. Inside was a folded piece of printer paper and a single flash drive. Clara stood up behind her. What is it? Helen didn't answer. Not yet. She stared at the flash drive for a long moment before slipping it into her coat pocket. The front door opened behind her, letting in the chill. Something had shifted. Again. The first rumor reached Helen by breakfast. Rachel had told someone at the gym, someone who told someone at the library, that Helen was mentally unwell, that the stress of the foreclosure had fractured her sense of reality, and that the county was still reviewing the sale. Helen stirred honey into her tea without looking up. Clara stood at the counter, back turned, scrolling through her phone. She's moving fast, Clara said. She's scared, Helen replied. I'd laugh if it weren't so boring. Helen didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her side drawer and pulled out the official deed, stamped, signed, and sealed. She slipped it into a clear folder, slid it into her tote, and rose from the kitchen chair. She wasn't going to chase down lies. She was going to wait for the knock. It came that afternoon. 2 neighbors from across the block, Eunice Holt and her sister Marian, pretended to be out for a walk, but conveniently paused near Helen's front garden, which hadn't bloomed since April. They waved awkwardly when Helen opened the door. We just heard things, Eunice started, already wringing her hands. About what happened. And we figured, better to ask than assume. Helen didn't blink. You heard Rachel's version? They nodded. Without a word. Helen stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside, the living room was modest but clean. The binder with her documents rested on the coffee table like a quiet invitation. She unzipped it and laid the deed flat. Everything's here, she said softly. Filed, recorded, no contest. Marian leaned over to read it. You bought it back? I did. Eunice frowned. On your own? Helen looked at her. Yes. No bitterness, no explanation. Eunice studied her face for a long second, then gave a slow, embarrassed nod. Well, that's good to hear. They left 5 minutes later with apologies folded into their goodbyes. Helen didn't follow them out. But from the kitchen, she watched them cross the street, whispering again, but not in the same tone. That night, Abby posted a photo on her Instagram story. The courthouse steps. Helen in the center, holding the deed. No filter, no caption, just the date typed in plain white font at the bottom, October 11th. Within an hour, it had been reposted 6 times. Abby hadn't tagged anyone, but word traveled fast when the narrative flipped. Rachel tried to comment something sharp. Abby deleted it. Then she blocked her. Sunday morning, church coffee hour buzzed like a hornet's nest. Clara stood near the pastry table, sipping her lukewarm styrofoam cup of Folgers, calmly swatting away gossip like mosquitoes. She faked the breakdown, someone muttered behind her. Clara turned, smiling sweetly. And yet, she still passed 3 legal reviews and outbid your cousin's real estate agent. What a miracle, right? One woman tried to joke that Rachel had been just trying to help Mark move on. Clara raised her cup in salute. Some people help by healing. Others help by hiding knives in casseroles. The table went quiet. Clara walked away, humming a hymn that wasn't in the bulletin. Monday afternoon, Helen pulled out her old baking tins. The oven creaked when she turned it on, unused for weeks, but the smell that filled the house made something shift in the walls, like the house remembered her again. She baked 3 dozen cookies, oatmeal, no raisins, and arranged them in cellophane bundles with a handwritten tag. "Thank you for the grace, Helen Ward." She placed 6 bundles in a basket and began walking them down the street. Not to win people, not to prove anything, just to remind the neighborhood she was still here. And still kind. That power didn't have to be loud to be real. On her way back, she passed the community bulletin board outside the post office. Someone had torn down Rachel's flyer advertising upcoming renovation services. It lay crumpled in the trash bin below. Helen kept walking. When she got home, a black SUV sat idling outside her driveway. A man in a dark coat leaned against the hood, watching the street with the posture of someone not used to waiting. Helen paused at the curb. The man looked up. "Helen Ward?" She nodded. He held out a small envelope. "You've been named in a civil discovery subpoena." He didn't smile, didn't explain. Just got back in the SUV and drove off. Helen opened the envelope, unfolded the document inside. And there it was. Rachel Donnelly v. Helen Ward, cause of action, defamation, intentional emotional distress, fraud. It started with the sound of keys. Not her keys. Mark's. Helen watched through the window as he stepped onto the porch like he still lived there, like he had the right. His jacket was unzipped, face flushed from the cold, spare key dangling between 2 fingers like a challenge. She opened the door before he could use it. He didn't expect that. "Helen," he said, tone casual but tight. "We need to talk." "We don't." He held up the key. "It's still mine. My name. Was removed. Along with the deed." "You know that." "I'm not here to fight. You brought a key." Mark looked past her into the house. "I just want to grab a few things." "No." He blinked. "Excuse me?" Helen stepped forward, 1 foot firmly on the threshold. "You don't live here anymore. You forfeited that when you rewrote the trust without telling me." "I'm not staying, I just—" "No." He looked at her, like he couldn't believe this was happening, like he still thought of himself as the one holding all the ground. Then he stepped forward, just an inch. But she didn't flinch. He stopped. 5 minutes later, the police cruiser rolled to a slow stop at the curb. 2 officers got out. One familiar, Officer Brenner, who had worked the school fundraiser security detail the year Abby was in 8th grade. Mark's tone changed immediately, shifting into his favorite performance. The concerned ex-husband trying to de-escalate a misunderstanding. "She's confused," he said quickly. "There's a duplicate key. I just needed to grab my tools from the garage, nothing hostile." Helen held out the deed, unfolded neatly from her bag. "This property is legally mine. The key was never authorized. He doesn't live here." Brenner took it, read it carefully. He glanced at the officer beside him, then at Mark. "You'll need to leave, sir." Mark's mouth opened, then closed. "This is harassment at this point," Brenner added, polite but clear. "If you come back without legal notice, it becomes trespassing." Mark looked toward the cruiser, then toward the street. That's when Rachel's car pulled up. She was already crying as she slammed the door and came barreling across the lawn, ignoring the officers entirely. "She betrayed her family," she screamed. "She turned Abby against her own mother. She's brainwashing everyone." Rachel's mascara ran like bruises down her face. Helen didn't move. "You always knew how to twist people," Rachel sobbed. You made yourself the victim, like you didn't ruin our lives. Brenner stepped between them. Ma'am, this is not the place. Rachel staggered back a step, but not before slapping her palm against Helen's front window. Helen stayed still. Inside, the house remained perfectly still. The kind of still that couldn't be faked. Rachel crumpled onto the edge of the lawn, hands shaking. Mark stood behind her, uncertain, jaw clenched. Helen didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. A few hours later, the sun was down, and Helen was halfway through organizing the drawer of mismatched chargers when the doorbell rang. She almost didn't answer. But when she looked through the peephole, it wasn't more noise. It was Abby. Helen opened the door. Her granddaughter stood with her overnight bag slung across one shoulder, sweatshirt oversized and eyes puffy. "Hi," Abby said softly. Helen stepped aside, letting the warm light spill into the porch. "I'd like to stay here for a while." Helen didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She just took the bag, set it inside, and held the door open a little wider. Abby stepped through. Later that night, Helen stood in the hallway, watching Abby asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked beneath her chin. Outside, the street was silent, the leaves shifting like whispers. From the hallway table, her phone buzzed once. A new email. Subject line, RE. Discovery response. Rachel Donnelly attached was a deposition list, and one name stood out at the very top. Abigail Ward. The law office sat above a coffee shop on the corner of Main and Elridge Avenue, tucked between an antique bookstore and a nail salon that had changed names 3 times in the last year. Helen took the stairs slowly, one hand on the polished wooden rail, the other gripping her leather folder. She didn't wear black. Not for this. She wore navy. Stronger. When she entered, the receptionist looked up, startled for half a second, then smiled politely. "Ms. Ward, right on time." "I usually am." "Attorney Talbot is ready for you." The office smelled like old paper and confidence. Dark oak furniture filled the space, and light from the tall windows cut across the room like clean lines in a legal brief. Attorney Samuel Talbot rose from behind his desk and extended a hand. "Helen, it's been a while." "Too long," she said, shaking his hand firmly. He gestured for her to sit. "You're looking to update your will?" Helen nodded, pulling out her papers. "I want it finalized before the end of the week. No loopholes." Talbot chuckled softly. "Then you've come to the right boring man." He read over the preliminary notes she'd submitted. Assets, property, residual funds, and the trust established back when she still thought Mark had her best interests in mind. "I want the house to go to Abby," Helen said before he could ask. "Not a joint share?" "No." Talbot studied her. "You're sure?" Helen met his gaze without blinking. "She's the only one who showed up." He nodded slowly, then made the note. "I also want a portion, 10,000, allocated to the Elridge Public Library. Youth section only, in honor of someone who helped me find my voice in 7th grade." Talbot raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "Approved. And the rest?" Helen didn't hesitate. "Split evenly between Abby's college account and a scholarship fund in her name." "And Mark?" "Removed." "Rachel?" Helen's mouth twitched. "She was never in it." Talbot chuckled again, but the air around them shifted slightly. It wasn't bitterness that filled the room. It was closure, finally setting like cement. "Everything you're asking for is legal, enforceable, and clear," he said, "but I'll need a witness." "I brought one." The office door opened a moment later, and Clara stepped in with a grin that had no business being that smug. "Well, well," she said, eyeing the document. "Is that the sound of legacies being rewritten?" Talbot offered her a chair. "You're the best kind of witness, nosy, reliable, and impossible to intimidate." "I practice," Clara said, settling in. Helen picked up the pen. The signature line waited. She didn't rush it. She signed her name deliberately, loop by loop, full middle name, every stroke grounded. Then Clara added her witness signature, flipping her pen once in satisfaction. Talbot stamped the document and slid it into a protective sleeve. Congratulations. Your estate is now yours again. They exited the office 20 minutes later into a wash of golden afternoon light. The sky above Elridge was unusually clear for mid-October, cloudless, crisp, and unforgiving in its honesty. Clara stopped beside the bookstore window, looking at Helen. "How do you feel?" Helen breathed in once. "Right." She didn't say free. Freedom had never felt like this. This was something deeper, rooted. Clara nudged her shoulder. "Abby's going to be floored. She deserves it." They turned toward the street, but as they approached the crosswalk, Clara paused. Across the intersection, a dark sedan sat idling. Rachel was behind the wheel, sunglasses hiding her eyes, but her grip on the steering wheel told Helen everything. She had followed them. Or maybe she'd just waited long enough to watch something she couldn't undo. Helen didn't stop walking. She crossed the street, past the sedan without a single glance. But as she stepped up onto the far sidewalk, her phone buzzed. A new voicemail, from Rachel Donnelly. She played it. The message was short. "You may have bought the house. You may have Abby now. But I know what you buried, Helen. And I'm going to dig it up." It started as so many things in Elridge did, with the mail. Not Helen's this time. Mark's. Or rather, Mark's former address. The letter had arrived at the wrong house first, Eunice Holt's. She brought it to the post office, confused by the return label. U.S. Bank Loss Mitigation Department. The clerk didn't blink. "Just drop it here," he said. But the whisper was already growing teeth. By Wednesday, 3 different people had mentioned it. Quietly, at first. Then with a hint of curiosity. Then with the low-grade glee reserved for people who had watched someone else walk away from the wreckage they'd caused. Foreclosure notice? On Sycamore Street? Mark's? Guess that trust didn't save everything. Helen sat at the window with her tea, watching the drizzle slick down the glass. Abby was curled on the couch behind her, flipping through an old yearbook she'd found in one of the attic boxes. Occasionally she laughed quietly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. Helen didn't press her. They were settling into something quiet now, something unspoken but sure. At one point, Abby looked up and asked, "Do you think he knew?" Helen turned. "Knew what?" "That all of this was going to fall apart." Helen considered that. Then, "I think he thought you would fall apart before he did." Abby nodded. "Well, he's bad at math." Across town, Rachel had stopped leaving the house. No more gym appearances, no more brunches at the cafe with her fake laughter echoing across the patio. No more renovation flyers. Her SUV was spotted only once, parked outside the county building for 30 minutes, hazard lights on, Rachel inside the passenger seat on the phone. The driver remained a mystery. Some said it was a lawyer, others whispered it was Mark, trying to sell off one of the remaining cars for quick cash. But whatever she was planning, it wasn't working. At Ethel's diner, the back booth hummed with quiet victory. Clara raised her glass of iced tea like a queen toasting the fall of a rival empire. "To tides turning," she said. "To trust funds failing," added the waitress Jenny, who had once waited on Mark and Rachel during their house-hunting phase and remembered Rachel sending her iced latte back 3 times. "To Helen," Clara said finally, eyes gleaming. Helen just lifted her coffee. "To forward motion," she said softly. The toast clinked gently, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Later that day, Elaine texted. "Elaine, FYI, public foreclosure notice just posted. 116 Sycamore. Filed this morning. Mark's name is on it. Rachel's isn't." Helen didn't reply. She just screenshotted the message and saved it. That evening, Helen found Abby on the porch steps, sweatshirt sleeves pulled over her hands, a blanket draped across her knees. The clouds above them had fractured, revealing thin lines of stars between them like threads in old lace. "He tried to guilt me," Abby said, not looking over. "Said I was choosing the past over my future." Helen sat beside her. "And what did you say?" "I said maybe the past had a better track record." Helen smiled faintly. They sat in silence for a while. The town street lamps hummed softly in the distance. The leaves rustled in half sentences. Then Abby asked, "If it had been different, would you have left him sooner?" Helen didn't answer right away. "I left a little more every year," she said. "He just didn't notice until the house disappeared beneath his feet." Meanwhile, across town, Mark stood in the driveway of 116 Sycamore, staring at the large red notice affixed to the glass. Notice of default. It was taped unevenly, wind-warped, corner already peeling. Rachel was in the house, slamming cabinet doors loud enough to be heard from the street. She hadn't spoken to him since the bank's call that morning. Not directly, but she'd thrown her coffee mug at the wall, so that counted. He walked away slowly, ignoring the neighbor across the street pretending to check his mailbox. At home, Helen returned to the email Rachel had sent weeks ago. The threat had been clear. "I know what you buried." She opened the attached document again, one Rachel probably assumed was still rattling her. But this time, Helen didn't flinch. She scrolled past the highlighted paragraph, past the screenshot, past the meaningless accusation, and clicked reply. Subject line: Ari. Discovery response message. Rachel. "Dig as deep as you need. I'm not the one drowning. H." She hit send, then shut the laptop. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but inside, everything stayed still. The courthouse smelled like lemon cleaner and anticipation. Helen stepped through security with nothing but her coat, a pen, and the envelope Clara had handed her that morning. No ceremony, no theatrics. Just paperwork and principle. The hallway echoed faintly with muted conversation, neighbors pretending they hadn't come to watch something burn. But they had. She took a seat in the same back row where, not long ago, she'd reclaimed her life. The plastic chair groaned slightly beneath her, but the weight was no longer fear. It was presence. Thomas, the auctioneer, stood near the front table adjusting the microphone with quiet efficiency. The same man, the same gavel, the same thin spiral-bound docket in his hand. But today, the eyes of the room weren't on him. They were fixed on the second row. Rachel sat stiffly, lips pressed into a strained line of artificial calm. Her hair was styled, makeup precise, but the frantic pulse just beneath her jaw betrayed her. Next to her, Mark looked worse, paler than usual, his hands clenching and unclenching around a folded paper that Helen guessed was a desperate objection, one that hadn't made it past the clerk's desk. Whispers rose behind them. "She's here again." "Isn't that his house this time?" "Turnabout's fair play." Rachel glanced back, saw Helen, froze for half a second. Then she turned around again, trying to pretend the air hadn't shifted. Thomas tapped the mic. "Thank you all for being here. Next item on the docket, Lot 4417, residential parcel, 116 Sycamore Street." A rustle moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. Rachel inhaled sharply. She turned toward Mark. "Do something," she whispered, voice sharp enough to cut. Mark didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the table at the front, face slack. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "This property is being auctioned due to loan default and unresolved debt obligations. Starting bid, $22,000. Do I hear an opening bid?" Silence. Rachel jerked toward her purse, nearly knocking it off her lap. "I need a form. Can I still bid?" Thomas didn't even look up. Only certified registrants may bid. Deadline was 9:30 this morning. She scrambled to stand. But this is my home. Our home. It was, Thomas said. Now it's a matter of public record. She turned to Mark. Desperate now. You said we had another month. He didn't answer. Helen watched without expression. Her card was tucked loosely between her fingers, face down. She waited. Thomas looked up, scanning the room. Do I have an opening bid? Helen raised the card. Simple, quiet, commanding. Bidder 72, Thomas said, checking the sheet. Opening bid, $22,000. Rachel made a noise, a short, incredulous bark of disbelief. You have got to be kidding me. More whispers followed. She turned, speaking to no one and everyone at once. She's just doing this to humiliate us, to rub it in. This isn't justice, it's obsession. No one echoed her. No one stood with her. Thomas resumed the formal rhythm. Do I have 23? Silence. He waited the allotted count. Going once. Rachel's heels clicked hard against the tile as she tried to storm to the front, but one of the deputies near the wall stepped forward. She stopped short. Going twice. Mark slumped slightly in his seat. He didn't lift his head. Sold, Thomas said, and the gavel came down with a crack that didn't just echo. It landed. Final. Helen signed the bid confirmation sheet 10 minutes later. Outside, the October sky had darkened, not storming, but heavy, like the clouds themselves knew something had shifted again. She stood beneath the arch of the courthouse awning, breathing in the cool air when the door opened behind her. Abby stepped out slowly, backpack slung over one shoulder. I didn't know you were coming, Helen said. I skipped class, Abby replied, unbothered. They stood there a moment, watching Mark and Rachel in the parking lot. Still arguing, still loud, but smaller now somehow. Dimmed. They never saw it coming, Abby said. No, Helen replied. They didn't think anyone like me could. Abby reached into her pocket and handed her a folded square of paper. This came for you. From the courthouse clerk. Elaine said it was urgent. Helen opened it slowly. At the top was a docket stamp. At the bottom, a date circled in red. Next Friday. Rachel's lawsuit wasn't just moving forward. It had been expedited. Pretrial hearing. 1 week. Helen folded the paper and smiled. Just once. Helen's signature landed on the dotted line with the steadiness of someone who had waited too long to be unsure now. Final page, Thomas said, sliding the document back toward her across the laminated table. It's official. His voice was softer than usual, not formal, not distant, almost respectful. She nodded. Thank you. He pressed the final county seal in place, crisp and blue and undeniable. Congratulations, Miss Ward, the property is yours. There it was again. Yours. A word that used to feel theoretical, dangled, withheld. Now it felt earned. Behind her, a wave of murmurs rustled through the gathered crowd like the hush of shifting wind. No laughter, no snickering, just awe. Tension cracking like ice. She bought it, someone whispered. She really bought it. That's her second one. On record, on paper, in her name. Mark stood by the far window, arms slack, a bead of sweat trailing along his temple despite the October chill. He looked like someone had unplugged him from the wall, disconnected from the very wires that once propped him up. Rachel, beside him, stared straight ahead, her lips parted slightly, eyes glazed with something that wasn't rage anymore. It was disbelief. This was the part of the movie they never thought would play. Thomas handed Helen a final envelope. Keep this sealed until Monday. It's for utilities and reassessment coordination. It's all just a formality at this point. She tucked it neatly into her folder, then turned. The room hadn't moved. Even the chairs seemed quieter. Abby approached first. She didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around Helen with the kind of hug that didn't ask permission or say, "I'm proud," because it didn't have to. It simply existed, full and fierce and alive. Helen let herself hold it, right there in front of everyone. No shame, no mask. When they stepped apart, Abby whispered, "They're never going to be able to spin this." Helen smiled faintly. "They'll try, but they won't win." Clara's heels clicked softly as she approached from the back row, arms crossed, the kind of grin that had sharp edges and long memory. "Well," she said, "justice finally." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You didn't think it was coming?" "Oh, I knew," Clara said, "but I thought I'd be dead or in jail before I saw it signed in ink." They laughed quietly. Behind them, Rachel took a step forward, then thought better of it. Her eyes met Helen's, searching for something. Maybe mercy, maybe a crack. But there wasn't one left to give. Mark opened his mouth, closed it, then glanced toward the exit as if just now remembering he had legs. A few neighbors moved aside as he passed. Not with deference, with distance. He didn't speak as he left. Rachel followed, slower, like someone trying to maintain dignity after slipping in public. Her shoes clicked out of rhythm. No one called after them. No one clapped. Just the faint rustle of paper as Helen closed her folder and slid it back into her bag. Outside, the sun had broken through the low clouds in a single sharp ray, illuminating the courthouse steps like a stage Helen hadn't asked for, but had earned nonetheless. Clara joined her at the bottom, linking her arm casually. "You ever going to tell me what's on that flash drive Rachel left you?" she asked. Helen didn't answer right away. She looked out across the street. The town was quiet. The wind had shifted. "No," she said, "but I'll know when it's time." Abby joined them moments later, holding 3 drinks. 1 coffee, 1 lemonade, 1 hot chocolate with too much whipped cream. "For the victors," she said. Clara laughed. "I could get used to this." Helen took the coffee. It was warm, solid, simple. A neighbor passing on the sidewalk paused, tipped their hat, and kept walking. Recognition, not pity. Abby stepped in closer. "What do we do now?" Helen breathed in deep. The wind carried the scent of leaves and something faintly sweet, a bakery nearby maybe. The courthouse door closed behind them with a soft, final click. Helen looked straight ahead, calm, unshaken. "We live," she said. Then, almost to herself, "They called me powerless, but when the gavel fell, all power was mine."